Flood Control Agency will now come to order. First order of business will be agenda approval.
Move approval. Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. It is so ordered. Public comment on matters not on the agenda. All right, we don't have anybody wanting to talk. No consent menu. And you notice I said menu. It's always fed with something. Item number 3 is consideration and adoption of Resolution 16-06-01, certifying the subsequent environmental impact report, adopting findings of fact and statement of overriding conditions, and appointing mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plans for the Southport Sacramento River EIP.
Good morning, President Denton and members of the board. Back in August of 2014, the board certified the final environmental impact report for the broader Southport project. And since adoption of that final EIR, staff has identified an additional borrow site that's adjacent to the project that was not analyzed as part of the original final environmental impact report for the project. This adjacent borrow site, which is referred to as Borrow 1, or in this context, the Borrow 1 project, contains material that's needed for construction of the Southport project. The Borrow 1 project consists of excavation of borrow material to construct flood risk reduction measures as part of the Southport project, and also remediation of the site, including a deeper excavation in one corner of the site, which will create a pond. And that excavated material will be used to restore the remainder of the site to its original grade and then return it to agricultural use. The original final environmental impact report analyzed effects of borrow activities for the project on farmland sites like the Borrow 1 site. But because the proposed Borrow 1 project would not result in an overall increase in the borrow activities for the Southport project, most of the project's effects are adequately disclosed in the final environmental impact report that's already been certified. However, in accordance with CEQA guidelines, this analysis therefore only considers new or substantially more significant effects that were not previously analyzed. And those effects are an existing effect on the loss of important farmland and agricultural production value, one new effect, which is a cultural effect, on tribal cultural resources associated with excavation of Borrow 1, and that's really in light of the passage of Assembly Bill 52. And then another new effect, which was a change in underseepage, associated with excavation of borrow material, and that was in light of the excavation adjacent to the Deepwater Ship Channel East levee in the Borrow 1 area. So those were the three, either two new and one change to a significant effect.
So, Greg, why did we have to move to Borrow 1 site? I mean, we had another site.
Because, well, we were unable to reach agreement with the other site for suitable material. That's one. And the Borrow 1 site was available, helped set costs, and had the type of material that we need for a portion of the core of the setback levee.
So we could not.
And also, I would also point out—
agreement with the Corps, or?
No, just another landowner. And the other property that I think you're referring to, there's also another project that has entered into an agreement and intends to use that other area for borrow, the SRCSD folks.
All right.
So. Okay. So with the incorporation of mitigation measures and other adjustments, most of the impacts can be reduced to less than significant. However, the following impacts as disclosed in the subsequent environmental impact report remain significant. And those are temporary increases in traffic volume from construction-generated traffic, air quality due to construction emissions, increase in construction-related traffic noise along the haul routes, exposure to construction-related noise and vibration, loss of farmland and agricultural production, deterioration of views and glare due to construction, and potential impacts to archaeological or cultural resources and possible human remains. So pursuant to CEQA, an agency certifying an environmental impact report and approving a project with significant and unavoidable impacts must make specific findings. These findings are contained in the findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations, which is attachment 1B to the resolution. CEQA also requires that the agency adopt a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and that's attachment 1C to the resolution. And by extension, if the board approves the resolution, then adoption of both of these would occur, and they are part of the recommended action. So with that, I would turn it over for any additional questions that the board has, and also recommend that the board support staff's recommendation.
Greg, just to refresh my memory, Borrow 1 is the Sarmento site, right?
Correct.
Okay. When did we acquire that?
Well, it was after August 14th of 2014, but I don't recall the exact
I
date.
can't remember either, so that's why it wasn't included in the original EIR at all.
That's correct.
Okay. And the second site you were just mentioning, that the sewer district, there's still the possible opportunity to get some materials from there, right?
That's correct. And the contractor, when we do award the construction contract for construction of the levee, the contractor is free to borrow material from wherever they choose, and they may choose to get some from that other site.
Okay.
No question.
No further questions. I need a motion here on item number 3.
I would make the motion to adopt Resolution 160601, certify the subsequent environmental impact report, adopt the findings of facts and statements of overriding consideration, and adopt the mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plan as adopted, as presented here for the Southport Sacramento Early Implementation Project.
I do have a question before we move forward. On the finding of facts statement, on 2.2, what does it mean when it says change in under seepage associated with evacuation of borrowed material? I mean, I want to make sure we're not putting the community at any kind of risk because of seepage as far as the deep water channel is concerned.
So that is a concern, and the way that that's being mitigated is through close observation through all excavation materials to see if any under seepage is observed, and if it is, material will be replaced back where it was excavated from in order to stop the seepage. It's more of a precautionary measure because the removal of material would change how seepage may behave, but we feel that we're significantly far away from the levee, that it should not be an issue. This is more of a precautionary measure.
Okay. I mean, okay, well, I guess I just want to make sure that the safety of our community is not put even in a little tiny bit of jeopardy because we're using borrowed material from this site. And the ship channel isn't the most secure facility that we have within our basic jurisdiction. So I just want to make sure that we monitor that very closely, and that we make sure that, you know, because it seems like there's a little bit of risk if you take something out and you see seepage, then trying to put it back in. That seems like there's some kind of risk that wasn't there before. All of a sudden now it will be there. And what does that mean long term? Okay.
Well, your statements are acknowledged, and they're also shared by staff, and so we will be closely keeping an eye on during construction.
That raises the question of the CUL-5, the effects of the cultural resources for tribal culture.
Yeah.
It's coming out of that same barrel point. How do we determine that they have a problem there that affects the tribal culture there?
So the effect is a possible effect that's described, not that the effect exists. So it's a potential effect. And per AB 52, which is the Assembly Bill 52, we currently have within the final EIR a cultural resource effect on broader cultural resources. And AB 52 requires us to not only look at broader cultural resources, but also take into account specifically tribal cultural resources. So it's more acknowledging that that effect is there and that we need to take steps to determine if it exists, and if so, mitigate accordingly. And our mitigation measures are adequate.
Any more questions?
Well, I would second Tom's motion.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve Resolution 16-06-01. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Motion passes. The presentation of problem identification and report of alternative analysis report on item number 4.
So President Denton, members of the board, I'd like to introduce Jesse Patchett with Wood Rogers. He was one of the project leads for the recent update to the WSAFCA's problem identification report and alternatives analysis report updates. So I'll turn it over to Jesse to provide the presentation.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Mr. President and members of the board, for allowing me to give you a presentation on our work for the West Sacramento flood program. Presentation today is just going to talk a little bit about the introduction and the background for the work that we did, as well as talk about our problem identification report and the alternatives analysis report that we recently completed for the city. I think I give everybody an overview of the results, talk about next steps, and then we'll open it up to answer any questions that you may have. So briefly, some of the background is, as you may be aware, the levees surrounding the city have been studied in detail as part of several previous efforts, one of which is the West Sacramento Levee Improvement Program that was done by HDR back in 2008 and 2009. In 2012 through 2015, DWR, as part of the Urban Levee Evaluation Program, conducted explorations and evaluations of a lot of the levees. And then most recently, the Corps of Engineers has evaluated levees as part of the Sacramento General Reevaluation Report. As you can see, there was quite a range in estimated costs to address the deficiencies that were identified. All the way back in 2008 and 2009, the original PIR estimated about $460 million to address the deficiencies, all the way through the GRR, which has an estimated price tag of about $1.18 billion. So with that spread, as well as some recent developments from state and local requirements, there was a need to do some additional evaluation. We wanted to update the total program scope and cost, specifically to address criteria that's outlined in the urban levee design criteria, as well as support findings for the city of West Sacramento as part of their adequate progress finding that was required by Senate Bill 5. This information was also used to inform a strategy where we believe it might make sense to invest additional monies to further refine and reduce the overall program scope, as well as just develop a plan for flood risk reduction investment for WSAFCA. So the team was Wood Rogers. We were the prime consultant for the civil analyses. We also partnered with Blackburn Geotechnical, who's currently supporting the Southport EIP project. CBEC was our erosion consultant. Bender Rosenthal supported us in right-of-way support services, helping us estimate costs for land acquisition. Senate Environmental did similar support for environmental mitigation. And we also had support along the way from MBK engineers, Larson Wurzel and Associates, as well as city staff. So briefly, the objectives of the PIR and the AR were to develop a baseline flood program scope and cost. So now, having the criteria that we have from DWR, wanted to, and as well as all the information that's out there from the additional studies, we wanted to develop what we thought was the overall scope and cost of the city and WSAFCA's flood program, as well as to support the adequate progress finding that the city was pursuing. Our approach, due to the somewhat aggressive schedule that we had, it relied heavily on available information. So we didn't go out and do a lot of geotechnical explorations or physical evaluations. We relied heavily on the explorations and the information that was contained in the original PIR, in the DWR's urban levee evaluation borings, as well as the information that came from the Corps' general reevaluation report. We evaluated that data against DWR's urban levee design criteria, and the flood protection requirements were established from DWR's ULOP criteria. So essentially, we evaluated everything to provide a 200-year level of flood protection. The deliverables from this effort resulted in a problem identification report that, at a really high level, identified where there are some deficiencies within the system. We then developed a alternatives analysis report that looked at different mitigation measures and alternatives that could be implemented to address those identified deficiencies and determine which one was the most cost-effective or feasible to be implemented. And we're currently finalizing work on a program scope and cost refinement report. So this graphic just shows at a really high level the identified deficiencies. I will note that the Southport deficiencies, those are all the deficiencies that were identified prior to the Southport EIP project. We fully expect that once that project is constructed, that those deficiencies will be eliminated. We had, there are freeboard deficiencies kind of sporadically located throughout the system. Sacramento River North Levee has some areas where it's not quite high enough. It also has some areas of under seepage. In general, the Sacramento Bypass South Levee, so the levee that's right there along the CHP Academy, is in pretty good shape just due to the recent improvements that were made as part of the CHP EIP project. Yolo Bypass East Levee, generally, for the most part, is high enough. There are some areas of erosion deficiencies, as well as some through seepage deficiencies that may need to be mitigated there. And we also have under seepage that were identified along the Deepwater Ship Channel East Levee, as well as the Deepwater Ship Channel West Levee. As you guys may be aware, the Port North and Port South, there were several deficiencies identified in those areas, just because for the most part there's not an actual official levee through those areas, and specifically Port North with the port operations, it's difficult to keep elevated water out of the port, just because there are so many facilities that actually go down to the water. This table here just is a kind of a tabular presentation of the different deficiencies, the length in miles from each of the systems. There's approximately 32 miles of freeboard deficiencies throughout the system. Very minor areas where there's geometry deficiencies. And I guess the other primary deficiency that we identified in a lot of the levees was under seepage. And then the other deficiencies were more or less intermittent throughout the system. We also identified there were some areas of potentially certifiable reaches. In general, these areas were areas where the EAP projects have recently been completed or will be completed in the way of the Southport EAP project. The only exceptions really are right south, or I guess that would be west of the port at the confluence of the Deepwater Ship Channel and the port. There were a couple of really small levee segments that we didn't identify any deficiencies there, so those are small segments that could be certified. There were also a few segments along the barge canal that didn't have any deficiencies, so those, as far as an overall program, are areas outside the EIP projects that we didn't have any existing identified deficiencies. This graphic just shows at a really high level the recommended remediation measures. So once we went through our alternatives analysis, we took a look at various mitigation measures that could be used to address deficiencies. So we looked at flood walls, we looked at levee raises, we looked at seepage berms, cutoff walls, and took all that information to develop what would be the recommended remediation measure. So as you can see, I guess starting Sacramento River North Levee, we've got some areas that there's some existing erosion, the existing rock silt protection that has failed. So we would be proposing to increase erosion resistance in those areas, as well as to do some slope flattening. There are some areas where the waterside slope is particularly steep. Flattening that out would be the preferred mitigation measure there. There's cutoff walls located in several of the levee segments, Deep Watership Channel East, Deep Watership Channel West levees. And then Deep Watership Channel West levee had pretty much erosion deficiencies located along the entire length, which was a significant cost for the system. So this table just presents the overall baseline flood program costs that were estimated from our effort, as well as compares that against the costs for each of the levee systems from the other evaluation efforts. I do want to note that for the DWR, GER, the urban levee evaluations, the GRR, and the 2009 efforts, the totals at the bottom don't reflect the totals earlier in the study, and that's particularly because in order to have an apples-to-apples comparison, we didn't include the cost to mitigate for the Southport EIP project, because in our evaluation, there was only a very small area of Sac River South right there, just downstream of the barge canal that we feel still has a deficiency, and the other studies didn't look at it as granularly. But in general, our estimate was approximately $635 million to address identified deficiencies. Because we were using existing information, there was a range of confidence, and there were some areas where we believe if we did additional geotechnical evaluation and exploration, as well as used updated hydrologic and hydraulic data, there might be the potential to actually reduce the baseline flood program cost to refine where we have identified deficiencies and maybe reduce mitigation measures. So doing that, we ended up with a low-end range of approximately $338 million. So we feel that the true program cost is probably somewhere between those numbers. And then again, we've got the, just for comparison, the other efforts that have been done. So as I mentioned, we're currently working on evaluating some opportunities to reduce the flood program scope and cost. Investing in additional hydraulic evaluations is one method. This study was based on the Corps' comp study hydrology, which is generally higher than the current DWR and the Corps working together on a Central Valley hydrology study hydrology, which generally has a lower water surface elevation. There are some areas where we have very minor freeboard deficiencies, and using a lower water surface would eliminate those freeboard deficiencies. Investing in additional geotechnical evaluations would certainly has the potential to eliminate some areas where we have very deep cutoff walls, particularly in the Deep Watership Channel East and Deep Watership Channel West levees. There is the potential that those could either go to shallow cutoff walls or be eliminated altogether. Similarly, there are some areas where we have shallow cutoff walls where we feel if we did additional geotechnical exploration and evaluation, we could either reduce the length of that wall or eliminate the wall altogether. Erosion evaluations, CBEC, the erosional consultant, again, we're just using available data. If they had the opportunity to do some additional site investigation as well as underwater bathymetry and collect additional data, there may be some areas where the identified erosion deficiencies are either reduced or eliminated. And then finally, another real estate is obviously a driver of a lot of the cost, land acquisition, and we didn't do a full boundary survey or title search as part of this effort. We worked with city staff and available documents to estimate where the levee districts and WSAFCA had right-of-way, and we used that to inform where we would need to acquire additional right-of-way as part of like seepage berms or the footprint getting wider. If we were able to nail that down, that would help us refine those costs. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we're working on a program scope and cost refinement report currently. We anticipate having that submitted to the city within the next month or so. We also anticipate a future phase to complete the additional evaluations that I just mentioned in an effort to reduce the costs and the scope and magnitude of the effort to inform FEMA and ULDC certifications. We're also going to be working with the city, I believe the Community Development Department, to look at an alternatives analysis for the bulkhead that's there between the port and the barge canal. We took a look at that, and we had an estimated cost of about $2.5 million to improve that system. It was based, again, on some assumptions, and we think that if we did some additional testing of the metal that was actually used to construct that, as well as look at some other alternatives to improve the closure structure there, that we might be able to reduce costs there. We're also working with the city on a stone lock public area access and safety plan, as well as establishing a line for a setback along Pioneer Bluffs. And then once we do the additional evaluations, we'll have the information we need to perform FEMA and ULDC certifications for those levees that are certifiable. With that, are there any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah, I got some. Jesse, could you go back?
Sure.
Let's see, go back one more. Keep going. One more. Okay, I guess go back to the deficiencies. No, go forward now.
Okay. There.
Is this identification of deficiencies, this is from previous information, basically?
These are the
GRR and other reports? I mean, did you guys, you said you did very limited investigations for this report, right?
Yes, that's a great question. So these are identified deficiencies as part of this report. These deficiencies were identified through our interpretation and evaluation of the available data.
Okay.
But to your point, the deficiencies are very similar to the results contained in the other studies for those reasons.
Okay, so, and then go forward to the next one. Again, this is basically from previous information, right?
Well, this essentially is just takeoffs of the
other one.
the graphic,
right?
Correct.
Okay, keep going.
Sorry. Oh, there we are.
Okay, and these are the recommended remediation measures. Is this basically the GRR recommendations?
These are recommendations that our team developed, looking at the identified deficiencies.
Uh-huh.
The recommended improvements are very similar to those that are in the
Okay, they
GRR.
don't differ to a large extent, huh?
Correct.
And it's hard to read this, but the improvements on the deep water channel, both east and west levees, are what? Is the east just strictly a raise of some sort? And the west is what does all that entail?
So it's a good question. The Deepwater Ship Channel East levee is a combination of a deep cutoff wall and a shallow cutoff wall. I apologize. The flood wall and the deep cutoff wall are very similar line types.
That's the red and then the maroon or whatever, huh?
Yeah. So for
Yeah,
Deepwater Ship Channel East, it's like the red and then I guess the tan color. And then for the Deepwater Ship Channel West levee, it's a kind of intermittent deep cutoff wall, levee raise, pretty much levee raise the entire length of the Deepwater Ship Channel West levee, and then rock slope protection.
Okay, okay. And those closely align with the GRR recommendations?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, keep going. Next slide. So these costs, I kind of lost track as to what is not in these estimates versus our overall. I mean, we had we have the core at 1.2 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Here we see 818 million. Is that what's taken out of that?
The Southport EIP project.
The Southport, okay. And likewise, the Southport EIP is out of these other ones as well.
That is correct.
So, okay, so we're at 634 on that first glance. You add in the EIP and our EIP projects, we're getting back up to that $900 billion, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then this next column of 338, this is a possible savings with alternatives coming in.
That is a possible savings if we conducted additional specific geotechnical and exploration and evaluation, additional freeboard evaluation using a lower water surface elevation. It is possible that a lot of the identified deficiencies would be eliminated. And so specifically, the big ticket item really is the cutoff wall. There's a lot of cutoff walls that we think the depth could either be reduced or they could be eliminated altogether.
Okay. There was no look at, a completely different alternative, i.e. Some kind of closure to the channel, deep water channel versus, repair to the levees themselves, right?
We did look at that.
But that's not included.
It's not included here, just we felt that the concept to advance that is still relatively early.
Mm-hmm.
If the city does decide to move forward with a closure structure, we have a pretty good idea of how that would update the cost, and it would significantly reduce the amount of improvements needed to the Deep Watership Channel West levee, as well as the Port North and Port South levee. So we have done an evaluation of what a closure structure, what impacts those could have to the city, but they weren't included in this document.
Okay, because I don't think the city and/or WSAFCA is going to do that on their own. I think there'd be a lot of collaboration with our partners, so.
Absolutely.
And if I could just add real quick, Tom, we did have them take a look at some of those alternatives. We kept them out of the main body of the document just because, one, it's not included as part of the recommended plan in the GRR, and
Right.
that project's not authorized yet. But we do have the data. We do have the ability to, when it's ripe, to take a look at it and bring it to the table. And so we did lay the foundation. We're just not ready to talk about it yet.
And there's a new GRR underway that may revisit that, so.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That and the basin-wide feasibility study that the
Right.
state's doing, yeah.
Okay. Next slide.
All right.
Opportunities for reduced scope. I understand what you're saying here, and they all could bring, reduced costs, but we're not advocating studying that now. Isn't this stuff that happens when you're actually going to move forward with a design of a particular component?
That's a great question. Between where we are now and design, there's a lot of information that we would need to collect. There's a tremendous amount of information that we would need to collect to go to design. Between now and planning, there is value in performing additional evaluations and explorations, specifically because we believe that there are some levee segments that could go from having identified deficiencies to having no identified deficiencies. So essentially that would reduce the overall levee miles that need to be improved, and those are levee segments that could be certified right away. It is also important that as the city and WSAFCA move forward to implement the plans, to have a good, a refined program scope and cost, that way whenever you go out for a 218 or an assessment, you have a refined, a real number as opposed to a number that might be higher than it needs to be.
So, Tom, if I could interject. So I think the value by doing some additional explorations, one, in work, for example, when we go to work with the Corps on what's the first reach that's going to get implemented under the GRR, having a little bit more information under our belt on some of these levee reaches will give us the ability to recommend to the Corps where we think they should start on the first project, from a worst first, and the ability to implement, and with WSAFCA to come up with the local cost share. Also, the city has to continue to make findings of adequate progress towards the urban level of protection by 2025. We know the Corps' implementation schedule is something like 17 years, which is well beyond 2025. So doing some additional evaluations that might result in no levee deficiencies in certain reaches that can be certified helps us towards that goal of reaching the end by 2025. And then certainly if and when FEMA decides to remap us, having a reduced program scope and certifiable or levee reaches that have been certified positions us much, much better for favorable mapping designation. So there's a lot of value in doing some additional explorations and reducing program scope.
Okay, that was going to be my next question is if we get federal authorization for the project and the Corps becomes a, you know, a full partner in the process, our investigations here can be shared and be beneficial to them. I mean, how does that process work?
So that's an excellent question, and one I talk about frequently, at least as of late. But before we would embark on and recommending, let's say, to the WSAFCA board or the city that we invest in other explorations, we would want to work with the Corps to ensure that those advanced explorations can be creditable as, or considered work in kind towards our cost share of the future federal project. So we would work to make that be part of our cost sharing agreement.
Okay. The program cost and financial report that you said you guys are working on and finishing,
Correct.
that was part of the original scope of the work you guys are doing?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that was the
Okay.
final deliverable in our
Okay,
contract.
and that'll be, I guess, officially presented to the city, but I think that particular component is important to WSAFCA
Absolutely.
to receive. So these additional opportunity, you know, to evaluate, that would be supplemental work done?
Yeah, the report is included with the scope of work that Wood Rogers currently has, but they are under contract with the city to do additional work should funding and authorization be granted. And so we need to evaluate. Based on the report, we need to evaluate what's the low-hanging fruit, what's the investment required, what's the return on that investment. These are the things that we would bring back to you as part of that report and share with you, and then we need to start planning for what that future investment looks like.
Okay, and I know this has been a city-initiated effort, but when we start getting into this area, you know, you know, I think we need to be actively involved in how what the scope and the funding.
Acknowledged, yes.
So, okay, keep going. I guess this there was some look at the stone lock and the bulkhead area,
That is correct.
and that will that be included in this program cost and financing report at all, or?
Yes, so the cost to rehabilitate the bulkhead structure is already included as a recommended improvement in the alternatives analysis report. The program scope and cost refinement report doesn't specifically, I guess, discuss these three items that are included here.
Okay.
Those are items that we don't feel have a large likelihood of reducing flood program scope and cost. Those are essentially items that I think are of interest to the city with their efforts in that area.
Their planning efforts up
Right.
there.
So they're not directly,
flood related per se.
but the results in that evaluation can be used to inform our later efforts.
Okay.
So, and just to expand on that a little bit, there's some grant money available to the city, and that basically is involved in the Pioneer Bluff Transition Plan. And there's a need to gain further certainty from a flood perspective on some of the features in and around that area, like the stone lock, the bulkhead structure, and where in fact the levee prism exists in the Pioneer Bluff area. You know, it's all high ground.
Which is going on right now, right?
And so, although WSAFCA is not requesting Wood Rogers to do these evaluations, the city will be, and we will benefit from the results of those evaluations. And so we'll be sharing that information, and the city will be sharing it with us.
Okay. I think I'm done. What's the next slide? Yep, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Greg, do we have you fed us so much information here that you got that in writing that we can review?
We can review the results of those analyses that were just listed.
That he has here, his presentation.
Oh, yeah, those reports are available on the WSAFCA website right now. They're very large, but you're welcome to, well, if you don't have a computer, that's difficult, but if you're interested in a hard copy of it, give me a week or two and we'll put one together for you.
Do you want a hard copy of this? I got that. But,
Yeah, they're easily accessible via computer at the WSAFCA's website, but if you would like a hard copy, just let me know.
yeah, that's all right. I'll use the website.
Okay.
Bill?
Just a quick question. We've just, in essence, sort of finished our GRR. We've gotten approval, so to speak. So we're getting ready for the WRDA, and has this seems like some new data that is coming in. Has this been vetted by the Corps or the people that did the GRR so that we're in sync? Because, you know, the GRR for us, I always thought was, that was the Bible. We needed to make sure we got that thing done. We needed it in a timely manner and everything else. And if there are any tweaks, changes, or anything, does it affect the GRR?
So, Bill, if you, or Jesse, I'd like to answer that. So, good question, Bill. And this evaluation really is independent of, and used a lot of the information that was gathered during the process of the development of the GRR, but it is not to be used to rebut the program that was recommended by the GRR. It's really to inform WSAFCA and the city. And primarily, this was really necessary to do because of the high price tag of the Corps' estimate. So trying to make a case to the state that we can get this project completed by 2025 at a cost of $1.2 billion, that's a tough story to tell. It's a really tough story to tell. So in assisting the city in making those findings of adequate progress, an evaluation like this was necessary. Also, and I think one of the key points here that I'd like to make is all of the data that they reviewed and a lot of the studies that were done in the past were not measured against the new urban levy design criteria, which came about in 2012. So all those previous evaluations that were done now needed to be measured against a different standard to see if additional measures were required to meet the new standard. And so that was the other main reason why this work was important. But certainly the Corps' estimates are very, very high. And we are not alone. Just about every other urban agency has done a similar study in order to bring those costs down to a more reasonable level so that the implementation of those projects are more achievable, more realistic. So really this is more of a reality check for us than it is to inform the Corps. However, when we get to project implementation, everything that we've collected, all the information that we have, the opinions that we have, the recommendations that we have will be shared with the Corps on a reach-by-reach basis as our project is implemented. So there is, the value of this will be shared with the Corps at that time. But it won't be shared in advance to redefine the GRR.
Okay, because my concern is if there is something that is found in this can save a few pennies, the GRR may have addressed it in a different way, like a cutoff wall or whatever it may be, that we don't need. And all of a sudden, you know, you've got some differences of opinion and you've got some conflict that could delay the project or not make it as strong a project as we originally thought.
Just as, so the Corps process under the GRR took a very high 30,000-foot level at what the levy deficiencies are. During project implementation, additional evaluations will need to be performed so they can be more precise with what the actual fixes are going to be on the ground. So the work that we've done and what we would recommend to the Corps would be along those lines of not doing a deep cutoff wall when one is not needed. So we do participate. They take the lead, but we do participate as a non-federal sponsor. And we are along from early project design and through subsequent phases of design and through project implementation. So we'll work together with them to make sure that we get the appropriate project with the appropriate features that are necessary to protect the city.
Hey, let me add another thing about the GRR. The Corps takes a very conservative look at costs.
Right.
They want to make sure that they have adequate costs. The last thing they want to do is have to come back to Congress and say they did not estimate, for number one. And then number two, they do that large number to base it against the benefits for a cost benefit. And if it's not there at that conservative, then there's issues as far as whether there's a federal interest. By using a large dollar amount and then measuring that against the benefits, our project came out with a benefit, I think it was around 3 to 1 or so. They're over 3, which is good. So that gives gives Congress the comfort that there is an interest there, and we do get the authorization. So that large number there, hopefully all parties will want to make that lower over time as we refine the project. But having that number there, I wouldn't worry about it. I think it's beneficial to have it there if we get the authorization.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nothing left on the agenda. Meeting's adjourned.